Hey friends, Jill here. Welcome back to Whispering Willow Farm. I am out in my raised bed garden this evening, which honestly has kind of taken a little bit of neglect. Our focus has been in the high tunnel for the last few weeks. And now that most of everything is planted out there, or at least the first round of it, I have finally been able to transition out here into the raised bed. And so behind me, I have got some cattle panel arch trellises. Traditionally, I have planted green beans on arch trellises. I have planted some tromboncino squashes. And in years past, I have just put up straight cattle panels and trellis tomatoes on that. I have done T-posts with electrical conduit and PVC tees and trellised my tomatoes that way. But this year I'm doing something totally different. So I'm going to walk through that with you guys, give you some of my pointers for planting tomatoes. Now I will preference this with, you have to figure out the best way to serve your family and meet your needs. And so we are doing a lot of high production varieties and systems in the greenhouse in the high tunnel. So we're doing a different trellising system there. We've pruned everything to just do like a 2-liter system. So everything in there looks different. And if I was only growing out in my raised bed for efficiency and high yields, this is certainly not the method I would go. So that is something to consider. It's just figuring out your trellising options. One, I wouldn't do this if it was just me because it is a lot of manual labor, super time consuming, but I had extra hands on the farm today, and when I was looking across all of the beds, it was a little flat and needed some texture. And so this is something that I'm not necessarily dependent on the crop, although I do believe it's gonna yield me something. This was more one of those things like, hey, this would be a fun experiment. I have more than enough space to do this. If you're working in a small space, I'm not sure I'd recommend this because one, I've never done it before, so I'm trialing it myself. But two, you just got to max out your space efficiently. And if I was working in a smaller space, I don't know that I would do this because I don't think it's maybe the best way to trellis, but I can give you more feedback on that later in the season. But first of all, I'm going to show you guys what varieties I am growing. So I've got 4 cattle panels up here. So the first 2 cattle panels are going to be planted with tomatoes, and then the back 2 are going to be planted with squash. So in years past, I've always grown a tromboncino squash. This year, I'm growing a cross of that. It's called a center cut squash from row 7. It's a cross between a tromboncino and a zucchini. So it's supposed to get no bigger than a zucchini, still have the curve like the tromboncino, the flavor, the texture. So that's going to be a fun one. But since I did want to grow a long dangling squash too, I got this variety, I want to say from M.I. Gardner, and I know I'm going to butcher the name, so I'm going to go ahead and pop that up here for you guys to see. I've never grown this one before. If you've been following me for some time, you know that I give myself a few experimental crops throughout the season that I grow just for funsies to try out. I do not designate a large portion of my garden to that because I am trying to grow the bulk of my family's food and I can't afford to do this. But the center cut squash is one of those experimentals. That Kakuzi squash I just showed you guys is also one of those. Everything else tried and true things that I've loved having in my garden in years past and will continue to have in my garden. But the tomatoes I'm planting out here today are heirlooms. We've got the Blue Beauty, which I've grown 1 year, but it's been several years back that I grew that. I have the Granny Cantrell German Red, which is a great red slicer. I have got the Blueberry Cherries and the Sunrise Cherries. Now, I grew the Sunrise Cherries at my last farm. Wasn't crazy about them, but then talked to other fellow growers and they just rave about them. So I thought, you know what, I'll give them a second chance. They're really beautiful in a salad. I'm thinking also through farm events we're wanting to have this summer and having different types of cherry tomatoes to throw on a salad, I thought would just be really nice. Unfortunately, I didn't start any yellow or orange slicers this year, and when I went to go buy them from the plant sale, no one had them either. So that's kind of a bummer on my part, and because the high tunnel took such a huge focus, and I didn't really know at the time how much space I was going to have designated to these areas, it just didn't happen. But those are all things I'm taking notes of and adding them just to next year. So a couple things I want to note before we get started is I'm going to be planting the outside of my trellis. Some people plant on the inside, and I think that might be okay depending on what it is you're growing, but I would say for most things it's pretty typical to plant on the outside, especially I'm planting tomatoes and I'm planting heavy dangling squash, and so this is just going to support that a lot better, and then I'm not having to like walk through the jungle. The jungle will kind of go up and over, and then I'll just have the dangling fruit is the idea. So the experimental thing I'm doing this year is growing my tomatoes on an arch trellis. So in my mind, these are all indeterminate varieties, which mean they grow pretty large. So a determinate is just going to grow to a determined height, and it's just going to put all of its clusters on at once, produce all of its fruit at once, and then it's kind of done its thing. With an indeterminate tomato, here in Arkansas, ours can get like 9-10 feet tall if they have a way to trellis that high, and they just keep putting on fruit until like the frost takes them out, or for us usually it's some sort of disease, which is when it gets super hot and humid towards the end of the season. So I do prefer growing indeterminate varieties. If you are growing a determinate variety, I think a Florida weed would be a great trellising method. But I thought, since I have done the conduit and the T-post, I have done the cattle panels in the past, it will climb as long as you give it support. So I thought even with the arch, surely it'll just continue to climb the arch. Now, I might have to do some maneuvering just like I would with any type of like tromboncino squash. I'm going in as it's growing. I'm trying to like help it climb appropriately, if you will. And I'll probably have to do the same thing with these tomatoes. But I'm okay with that. So as far as the squash that I'm planting, I will plant one on each side of the trellis and let it climb over. And I am expecting the center cut squash to act a lot like the tromboncino squash, and so for that it produces so much. That's another thing, if you're trying to gauge and figure out how much food to grow for your family, keep a notebook. If you have your phone, I always keep notes of when I plant things on my phone, and then I will record the yield. So every time I harvest the squash, I'll have a scale, and I'll probably just keep it under the pavilion, weigh it all, jot it down either in my notebook or on my phone. And that's just a great way. And if I notice, oh man, that plant, because it was that variety, I loved the flavor, but it didn't produce as much as the tromboncino did, I'll just add in maybe another cattle panel of it. Maybe I could afford to put another one on a single arch trellis. So those are just some kind of good note-taking tips that I like to use, and hopefully they are helpful for you as well. So there are a few things I want to mention about the tomato plant before we plant it. So this is the granny cantrell. These should have been out of my greenhouse some time ago, but we all know other things take priority sometimes, and that's okay. So for me, I would ideally have this plant out way before this stage. Most of my plants are producing blossoms already, and we're going to address that in a minute too. But one thing to note, whether your plant has gotten a little leggy like this guy, or is shorter, it is important to go ahead and take off like lower foliage. And what I like to do is go through and pinch the blossoms off as well. So this plant is a great example of that. You guys can see some blossoms over here. And yeah, there's just so many blossoms. So I'm just going to go through with my finger, pinch these off. Nobody cry. All my first-time gardeners, don't be upset with me right now. There's a few reasons why we do this. Why we do this is because this, like the whole root system for this plant, is right here at the very bottom of here. Not a lot. I can even pop it out. You guys see all the roots surrounding it? This needs to really focus on this part of the plant. The last thing it needs to do is try to create clusters of tomatoes when it doesn't even have, yes, this is an established root system, but it's not established in the soil, in the ground, where it's going to live out the rest of its days. I promise it gets less painful, you guys. So after you have pinched all the blossom off, even if you are buying your starts from, say, a local nursery or a hardware store, wherever, and you see, like you walk by and you want to get the plant that's the most established, and you you and me, even like this is something I was guilty of in my beginning years, you think, oh, well, if it's already starting to set fruit, it's a more established plant. Actually, you want to not get those, and I even go by and snip those off when I see them at the local store, because I'm like, no, like this is not where it needs to send its energy. So essentially right now, even though this does look like a pretty large tomato plant, it needs to be focusing all of its energy in its root system, and just really establishing that root system in the new area that it's going to call home. And instead, when you see those blossoms, just the plant, it triggers the plant to immediately send its energy there and start forming that fruit, and we don't want that. So that's the first thing we did. Now we're going to go through and we are going to remove the suckers of the plant. And essentially what the suckers are these little things right here that pop up in the V or the armpit of the plant. And you'll just go through and pinch these off. Now this is something you will continuously be doing throughout the season, is when you're going and you're pruning your plants and you're checking on stuff. If you see that little, little plant start to form in the armpits, go in and pinch it off. If it's gotten really big, you can just take your pruners or your scissors and go in. The cool thing is too, is if you've missed one and it's gotten big enough to still pinch, you can take it, root that thing in some water, and you can have another tomato plant. So sometimes that's nice. I've done that several times where I didn't plant enough or start enough tomatoes to begin with of a particular variety. So I will let one of those suckers get bigger, pinch it off. I do prefer them to get a lot bigger than that right there. Like usually the suckers that I'm keeping are pretty decent, several inches tall. Rooting them inside in a windowsill, bringing them back out when you see that they have roots. You will need to do that hardening off process again, especially if you have them in water in your house. Otherwise they just kind of get scorched by the sun. So that is another option to do. I'm just gonna go through, cut the lower leaves off. That one looked a little sickly. And we are gonna actually move into the bed, and I'm gonna show you guys how I'm planting these and just some tips that I've learned throughout the year that have proven really helpful. We've had such great success with tomatoes for the last probably 5 years. And I really do think it has a large part to do with how we plant them and how we continue to care for them throughout the season. So one helpful tip, no matter what it is that you're planting, is making sure that you are planting either early in the morning or later in the evening. We have a forecasted week of high 90s, and so literally by like 9 or 10 o'clock it's pretty like already in the 80s, pretty hot. And so I have chose to do this at night because I would hate to transplant these out, be done transplanting at 9 or 10 o'clock, and then it start getting super hot. So just kind of check your forecast, be familiar with that. But it is best if you're direct seeding, that doesn't make that big of an issue. I still prefer to do it early in the morning, late at night, so I'm not exposed to the sun in the harshest part of the day. And so that's something to do. Another thing is I like to water my soil really well before and after. So what I did about an hour ago, I turned on all of our drip irrigation. So the spaces that I plan on planting are going to be pretty good and moist. And then if I feel like they need another soaking, then I'll just turn the drip on again for a little bit. But you guys can see here, this plant's a little wonky here. So I'm gonna show you one trick that I'm actually not gonna do, but that you certainly can do. And then I'm gonna show you guys how I actually plant it. Tomatoes really enjoy being planted deep. So let's say you have a smaller plant than me. Let's say your tomatoes look this big. That, in my opinion, is a pretty ideal plant to plant out. What I would do is remove all of the leaves except the top layer, and I would plant them like that deep. So I would remove this leaf, plant to here. But since this is super tall, I have trimmed all the bottom foliage off, and I'm gonna plant here. So that is several inches deep that we're gonna be planting here. So let's say your tomato plant had gotten super leggy, or even like this one is kind of at a curved angle here. You can actually plant it sideways. So you can dig your hole, lay it sideways without breaking it. This plant is going to gravitate upwards towards the sun. So that's the really cool way, and that's a great way to kind of encourage your plant to straighten out. So that's one option, is you would plant it like this and make sure this part was up. It would kind of be curved like that, and then in literally probably just a couple days, this top part will be popped up and great. So I think I can get 2 on each trellis here. So I am just using a garden trowel. This is kind of crucial, especially, you know, sometimes you can get by with using your hand if you're just seeding beans or maybe direct seeding some radishes. But when you're trying to dig several inches deep, having the proper tool definitely helps with that. Here we have our tomato plant. You can see it certainly doesn't look leggy at all. It looks like a good established tomato plant. It's planted so deep that it will definitely just start redirecting energy and creating a better root system. Something I wanted to show you too about the root system. I'll grab another one to demonstrate. If you don't hang out in your garden, just crisscross applesauce, what are you even doing? So on this one, there's a few things to point out here. This is the sunrise bumblebee. Like I said, my heirloom tomatoes out in the raised bed, I didn't even know if I was going to be putting a bunch of tomatoes out here. They kind of just got neglected. So this is one of those things that it happens to the best of us. Give yourself some slack. So 2 of these got seeded, and I never ended up pinching or thinning them, which I don't recommend because one, now both of these plants are fighting for the same nutrients, and they're in this very compacted 2.5 inch pot. So if you did start seeds or you plan on doing another round, if you see more than one, go ahead and pinch that sucker off or separate them, which I didn't do. And surprisingly, like, they look like not nutrient deficient, so I am pretty impressed with that. But I am going to separate these now. I could take pruners. I'm not intending to plant both of these, so if one gets a bit more damage than the other, I'm okay with that. It'll probably just go composted to the chickens. You guys can see I'm being kind of rough. Plants are super resilient. So, like I said, this should have been done a while ago, but if I chose to plant this, it would have done just fine. So the thing I want to show you, I'm going to go through, I'm going to remove all the bottom stuff just to show you how much easier this is. I'm taking off all the suckers that we had talked about in the armpit. You can see this one's kind of a bit bigger. Now this was a sucker right here that I did not prune in time. You guys see that? And so now it is a sucker that spit from the top. So if I were to prune that right now, I would stop the growth. So now this is just going to be a 2-liter plant, and that's okay. But that is something to be mindful of. I heavy prune. If you don't and you notice that, like, oh man, my plant got topped, essentially what that means is a sucker that has grown off of the main stem. So this sucker right here grew off of the main stem and now has become a main part of this plant. So there's no pruning that, or I will have topped my plant, meaning it will not grow past that. So I'm not gonna do that. And that's okay, it happens all the time. That's why it's just really important to keep eyes on your plants, be really diligent about pruning, because that can happen very, very easily. But what I wanted to talk to you about the root system was, if you guys can see down here, there are all of these little bumps on this plant. So these are actually roots that just have not developed yet. So sometimes you see these on smaller plants. Often I am seeing signs of this on larger plants. So the plan is you want, you know, all of these roots that are just waiting to develop, you want them in the ground so they can start developing. So that's something too. If you see those bumps and you think, oh man, what's wrong with my tomato plant? Something's going on. That's not it. They're just roots. So that's another reason why it's really important to plant your tomatoes really deep. That way you're allowing all those roots to kind of spread out into the soil, grab hold of the soil, and just suck up all those nutrients that's in your soil for your plant. So I'm probably just going to plant this to about here, which will be still several inches. I am going to try to figure out if I want my cherry tomatoes first and then my large slicers, and then going into my squashes. So typically what I like to do is lay everything out first. It's one of the reasons I love starting things. I really don't direct seed a whole lot. I like to transplant just so I can physically lay hands on it, and then move it around. So I'm gonna work on laying all of this out, and then we'll get busy planting. Also, a little side note, I do not encourage you to walk on your beds. If you can avoid it at all costs, that's good, because you avoid compacting your soil. However, sometimes it's inevitable. I could walk on my raised bed right now, or I could not plant tomatoes. And hello, we're gonna plant tomatoes. So sometimes it's inevitable, but I don't recommend walking through or on your beds often, because it does just add compaction to your soil. So typically you plant your tomato plants about 18 to 24 inches apart. This largely has to do with your pruning technique. So I hard prune, and what that means is essentially I'm taking off most of the foliage except for what is producing fruit. Now that's easier to do in the high tunnel because I'm gonna have a shade cloth on there. I've always done this even out in my raised beds, but you do have to watch for things like sun scald. So I try to keep some of the foliage around the cluster, but any other excess foliage I take off. By leaving the foliage around the cluster, it provides some sort of shade, but then by taking the bottom parts out, it allows for really good airflow. And because I do that hard pruning, I find that I can get tighter spacing. So these are 4-foot cattle panels. So even though I am choosing to hard prune, I still just don't think I have enough space. I know how these plants grow to put any more than 2 on this 4-foot cattle panel. So I'll probably do them right on the inside of each of these T-posts, and then that'll give each plant plenty of room. All right, now we get to do the fun thing. Let's start planting. So while you can put the tag that you started these in the ground, if you're using plastic, they are going to probably break down over time. If you're using wooden ones, they're definitely going to break down from the water and things like that. So what I like to do best is jot it down, take a picture. Like in my earlier years, I would take a picture and add text to it. Now I've got, you know, spreadsheets and crop plans and things like that, so I know where everything is. But I do think it's usually like a good idea to have a second option for tagging, just aside from the little plastic or wooden thing that you're using to tag them. Another helpful tip is if you are using drip irrigation like we are, I mentioned that I would probably be putting them one at each T-post. Typically what we do with all of our flowers, any other transplants, is we're also planting where there is a emitter in the drip. So therefore, where there is a hole in the drip irrigation, plant your plant there. That way, you know, it is immediately getting access to that water, and it's good because it's already like spaced out for you. And just like that, I've got my heirloom tomatoes out in the ground. Now, granted, I've got, what, 2, 4, 6, 8. That's not a ton of plants. It's not going to produce a lot, but this isn't where I was producing or growing or planting the bulk of our tomato needs. That was out in the high tunnel. We will also do a fall round of paste tomatoes, stuff like that, to make all of our sauces. So this is just round 1. That is the benefit of growing in a high tunnel, is that you are able to grow several successions and still be fine. Probably my last tip is, I know a lot of people that drop an egg, like literally just a whole egg from their chickens or their store, when they're planting tomatoes to add calcium. That's one of those kind of like I don't want to say like old timers, because I mean there's a lot of wisdom that they have to offer, but that is something that you will hear the older generation do. I've done that 1 year. I don't really know that it did or didn't work. For me, I believe in the power of adding nutrients into your soil before you plant and throughout the entire season to where it's feeding your soil. Now you could go through with a worm tea, a compost tea. We'll go through with Ultra from Agri-Grow, and it's a prebiotic, so we'll be treating all of these with that, and it's just a prebiotic fertilizer. So you can do things to kind of give your plants an extra boost. If you notice things like transplant shock, which is where they're kind of set back a little bit, or they might have a sun scald where the leaves are burnt a little bit. Don't be discouraged. More than likely they will bounce back. It is important to be hardening off your plants before you're doing this. Also, crucial that you're watering properly, that you're planting them out at the right time of day. If you've got a windstorm or a hailstorm coming, hold your plants in the house or the greenhouse. Don't plant them out. Like, make sure you're checking the forecast. That's something that religiously, when I'm planting out in the beds, in the fields, that I'm making sure I'm checking the weather to see what it's like. If it's just a light rain, yeah, make sure you get your plants out, let Mother Nature do what she needs to do, and then it's like a step you don't have to do. So those are just some of the tricks that I've learned throughout the years. Hopefully this was a helpful video. If you didn't know some of these things, maybe it helps you when you're planting your tomatoes. But I've got some more squash to plant, and then it's dinner time. So thanks so much for hanging out with me. I'll talk to you soon.